Today, Spain is known mostly for a questionable work ethic and an inquisition that no one expects. However, during the medieval era, it and Portugal were a battle of faiths and cultures. Christianity versus Islam, Roman Arabic heritage. Over the course of 700 years, the Christians would gradually push the Moors out. This period in Western historiography is called the Reconquista and is seen as maybe not a positive nowadays, but similarly to the Crusades, a series of wars to expand Christian hegemony and foundational to the Western world. Which naturally begs the question, what if it didn't? To be honest, any number of points of divergence could work. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll say that the rump kingdom of Asturias is crushed early in the 700s, and the entire peninsula is occupied by Islamic forces, gradually converted like Morocco, Syria, and Turkey in our world. Yay, problem solved. Now, there is the matter of the Crusades in about 400 years, but frankly, I'm not worried considering their track record. Maybe there's like a Principality of Catalonia propped up by France for a decade or two before they get distracted by England. By the time France is able to look southward, the Islamic culture in Spain will be nearly 600 years old and hard to dislodge. Now, here's a fun question. How does Morocco play into this? In our world, the breakdown of al-andalus, by then known as the Caliphate of Cordoba, gave rise to the Taifa period of warlords and city-states. The Almoravid dynasty in Morocco exploited this to take over from the south, having been invited due to fears of Christian advances. But in this scenario, when Cordoba breaks down, there's no reason to invite the Moroccans in, and the Almoravids, if they still exist, didn't care about the collapse until they got the please invade me letter in the mail. Thus, I'm inclined to believe that the collapse of Cordoba will see a much longer Taifa period and possibly long-term division. However, I do think they'll eventually congeal into larger kingdoms again within a century or so. Spain's Christian kingdoms went through constant periods of reunification and division until Castile, Aragon, and Portugal cemented themselves through a number of shenanigans. So I see no reason to assume that the Sultanate of al-Andalus wouldn't re-emerge. Now, up until the end of the Taifa period, the Umayyads were generally more tolerant of Christian and Jewish minorities than their contemporaries would be of Muslims and Jews. While it's entirely plausible that the reunited Sultanate of al-Andalus changes course on this policy under a native dynasty, it is worth talking about. While these groups would be discriminated against and have societal pressures to convert like we see in a lot of these societies, they'd be much better off than minorities usually are in medieval empire. This likely means that al-Andalus spent most of the medieval period as a cultural center for all faiths, and likely retains a large amount of prestige from this reputation. It wouldn't be unheard of for French kings to learn Arabic, or for Italian merchants to converse in al-Andalusian romance on the shores of Valencia, for example. Also, no Inquisition, a lot more Jewish people in Iberia as a rule. So what does the surviving/reunification of al-Andalus mean for Europe writ large? Well, ignoring any number of marriages, such as Richard I marrying a Navarrese princess, a lot of general trends will remain similar. This has little effect on the Norman conquest or the subsequent 100 Years' War. There was a Castilian civil war that had ties to that conflict, but ultimately the Castilian involvement was minor since it was largely a matter of securing alliances, and only created some naval support for the French. Technically, Edward III's grandmother was a Navarrese princess, but fundamentally the question of English rights in France and the constant intermarriage between the dynasties involved to quote-unquote settle the disputes is always going to create something like the 100 Years' War. I also don't really think this impacts the Crusades that much out east. Like I said, their track record was abysmal, and their main accomplishment is still some random countries that no one cares about anymore. The Byzantines still collapsed, Bulgaria still almost has an empire, the Ottomans still definitely have an empire. But this is when stuff finally gets crazy. Because if the Ottomans still have an empire and take Constantinople, then they still have their Silk Road monopoly and shut the Christians out from trade with the East. So there's still suddenly a demand for overseas exploration, but it's going to look very different. Al-Andalus has no reason to go overseas. They can still trade with the Ottomans. Without Portugal, no one's going to go around Africa. So what does that mean? It means that Columbus, if he still exists, can't go to Iberia. Plus he probably doesn't want to, since they're Muslim, and he's trying to skirt around a Muslim empire anyway. So our plucky pair-planet perceiving pioneer heads to France instead for his adventures. Now, I said I don't think that al-Andalus would have drastic consequences for the rest of Europe, but to be clear, I do think that they and France especially would have bad blood. You can't have two powers like this without some conflict. I don't think territorial exchanges would be common or drastic, but it's something to keep in mind. In addition, I do think that al-Andalus would be a little more populated than Spain was in our timeline just because there'd be less external conflict and constant razing of cities, even with the few Taifa periods. The lack of a Reconquista or Moroccan invasions would be the main cause of this. Regardless, Columbus goes to France. This alone is kind of its own timeline, but the most I can really say is that until someone sails from Aquitaine, don't expect some form of French Mexico or anything. From Brittany, where Columbus would set sail from, he would likely land somewhere in the American South. While this has its own consequences, as sugar and tobacco plantations could pop up from here, it would still take time and perhaps decades of exploration to get down to Mexico and the Aztecs. So you'd see French settlements dotting the Carolinas and Cuba long before you get them down to Mexico, and by that point, while there would be a fresh epidemic, the empire will have stabilized from the earlier pandemics. While there is still a high mortality rate and the French could probably conquer the empire, being aided by your nobility and common people alike does tend to do that, it will be a looser organization than New Spain was in our world. Sorry for the interruption, but if you're liking the video so far, please consider subscribing for more alternate history videos like this one every week. Very interestingly, I think the Inca Empire probably survives in this timeline. Think about it. France is already working from further up north. Its base of operations is in Georgia and Carolina, not in the Antilles. Even the conquest of the Aztec Empire is decades later, meaning that the Inca have a lot more time to stabilize after their civil war. Now, I do think that a hypothetical French Colombia would have a few wars with them, but it wouldn't be nearly enough to topple the entire empire in one fell swoop. This is actually very important, both because it means there's a native empire in the Americas that survives to the present day, but also because of the Potosi Mine, which is one of the largest silver mines on the planet. In our world, it was a major source of wealth and power for the Spanish, and here it is deprived of a year of European exploitation. Now, once the Inca realized that silver is the second most valuable thing on the planet to Europeans and Asians at this time, I think we'll see a lot of dubious labor laws, but it cannot be overstated how much of an economic edge this gives them in particular. They'd be able to fund massive armies for any European allies they have, or buy very powerful allies if they need to. Now, if we assume the Protestant Reformation still happens, then we have our next major European butterflies. The Netherlands traced their independence back to the 80 Years' War and the revolt against the Spanish lowlands. The Spanish lowlands only became Spanish due to Mary of Burgundy and Maximilian of Austria, as their son married into the Spanish royal family and passed his land down to Charles V. Even if Mary and Max still exist, unlikely due to almost any Iberian dynastic marriages being impossible, the Dutch territory can't pass to a Spain that doesn't exist. This means that Philip the Handsome, yes, that's his actual name, I'm not joking, would either marry some relatively minor German, English, or French princess, or the land simply remains with Austria. This alone has massive consequences for any hypothetical Dutch revolt, but it's entirely plausible the revolt never happened. While the Habsburgs were far from the most tolerant of theological dissent, they were still better than the Spanish. However, without the personal union over the massive Spanish Empire, the Austrian Empire itself is much weaker. Now, this scenario has gotten away from the supposed premise a bit. So let's return to Iberia. First, they are much, much weaker than Spain was in our world. They lack American gold, meaning their armies and navies are smaller and weaker. They lack the Dutch territories, meaning no world-class ports. Cadiz is also much less relevant here. And they lack Habsburg dynastic and diplomatic clout. But you know what they do have? About a century of stability relative to the rest of Europe. Probably. See, by now I'm placing this timeline at about the 1600s, meaning that Martin Luther is about to nail his theses to the door and light Europe on fire for 200 years. Now, if I had a nickel for every time a German set Europe on fire, I would have, at minimum, 4 nickels, which feels disproportionate for a country that only united in the 1870s. Marx and Franz Ferdinand, or Wilhelm II, for those wondering about the other two. So, al-Andalus would have about a century where it's the only state in Europe not dealing with religious upheaval. Hell, its Christian minorities would probably spend most of the time fighting themselves. This gives them a chance to start some colonization of their own. After all, they might not need Indian spice or Ottoman trading rights, but they do like gold. Unfortunately, it's kind of impossible to predict where they, or England for that matter, would settle. My best guess is they start going around West Africa, where they will find more Muslims and gold, but probably not be able to get much out of it. They would already have greater trade links with these nations than Spain and Portugal did in real life due to a greater political continuity between Islamic powers. Hell, there might be Andalusi nobility marrying into West African powers like the Mali Empire. Because aren't dynastic questions fun? Regardless, it's not until they get to the Congo and Central Africa they have many opportunities to get up to shenanigans and exploitation. Even then, it's entirely plausible that they'd have to fight England for it, because again, I have no idea where they're going. For fun, we'll say that England still gets Virginia and I guess the Cape of Good Hope. By this point, it gets very hard to make any predictions. I haven't really talked about the Italian wars, but France and Austria spent the 1490s to 1540s fighting over the region in a giant peninsula measuring contest, which happens to coincide with the potential Aztec conquest, meaning that by the mid-1600s, France could have secured Italy at the cost of its relationship with the church and gone Protestant as a result. Or it conquers the Aztecs after it decisively lost the conflict, and it just doesn't do that. The American Revolution is probably butterflied away just due to logic, but that doesn't mean the colonial elite and even the lower class in Mexico don't get any ideas. Anything involving India or China would be complete fiction, and Europe alone was already hard to keep straight due to the dynastic nature of politics at the time. But if you liked this video, then please do consider subscribing for more alternate history content, and leave a comment down below if you want more in this particular universe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day.